So his patriarchal blessing gave the insight that he needed to know who his parents were and his place of birth were. And I just find that to be so significant, and I wish I could have been in that room. Hello, welcome to week 4 of Mix It Up, Black History in the Restoration. I'm Taylor Ricks, and what we do on this series is we mix up a fun recipe while we mix up the restoration by talking about an African American member of the church in the early days, so like a pioneer or early member of the church who is African American. So I'm so glad you're here to join me today. Today we're going to be making cinnamon rolls, a family favorite, while we talk about John Burton. Also, I am a total germaphobe, so please know I sanitize my surface, my tools, my hands 1,000 times, but I don't make you watch me do that. Just know it happens so your heart can feel, my fellow germaphobes can feel okay about it. Okay, so John Burton. Okay, so John Burton, he was a slave to a man named John Burton. So that's gonna get a little confusing. He was a slave in Pike County, Missouri. And one more thing I didn't say. If you want huge cinnamon rolls, you use all the dough at once and you can get a dozen big ones on a cookie sheet. If you want average size, I use half of the dough and I can get 24 on a cookie sheet or in a 9x13 pan. Okay, now we're ready to start. I like to do half of the dough most of the time so that it goes a little further. Okay, John Burton was single when he first owned John. And then he got married in 1835 to Susan McCord. And later on in the 1830s, we don't have direct account of when exactly it was, but in the 1830s, the three of them all joined the church together. And John Burton, the slave owner, and Mary had 2 children together. But then sadly, John Burton, the owner, passed away in 1838. So he was only a member of the church, obviously, for about 3 years before he passed away. So after he passed away, Mary McCord, as you well know, the members of the church got forced out of Missouri, and Mary McCord decided to go with them and to take John Burton the slave with them. And so they left Missouri and they went to Nauvoo. And in Nauvoo, they got well immersed in the culture and the religion, and that is when Mary met Joseph Lee Robinson, and she married him and became his second wife. So in so doing that, John Burton now is owned by Joseph Lee Robinson and Mary McCord together because of the laws of marriage and of passing, the passing down that happened when John Burton, the owner, passed away. So they lived in Nauvoo for a little while, but then, of course, they get kicked out of Nauvoo. And so Robinson kept a really good journal, her new husband, which helps us learn more about John Burton, the slave, because he mentions him a few times in his journal. So on their journey from Nauvoo to winter quarters, he talks about John Burton, and he said his daughter Anna Maria had become a cripple and couldn't walk. And then he said Brother Johnson's son got the measles, so he was out of commission. And then he said that his colored man that belonged to his second wife was milking a cow. So this is John Burton, and he was milking a cow and he hurt his knee, and so he was a cripple. And this is what he said. He said, "The Lord helped us and we kept along. Our cripples soon got better of their lameness." So he does mention him there. So we know that John traveled with them from Nauvoo to winter quarters. When he got to winter quarters, there is a record that says that John Burton dug a grave for a fellow member that had passed away, and it's recorded by the church clerk as his tithing payment, because he did that without any payment. So they considered it his tithing payment that he dug that grave for that fellow member of the church. So we know that he was trying to be active. So in winter quarters, he also lived next to a man by the name of Green Flake. Green Flake is somebody that we're going to be talking about in week 6. So not next week, but the next week, who was also an African-American slave member of the church. So him and John were friends, I guess you could say, or they were in the same ward. They were ward members together. So that's kind of a cool thing to know. Then, after some time there, Burton went ahead of his family, of the Robinson family, to Salt Lake. So he left in 1847 with a migration that left earlier, and it was because the Robinson family wanted him to go ahead and prepare a home and a homestead for them for when they arrived in Salt Lake City. So he arrived a little less than a year before the rest of the family, and traveled there and did that. And this is what Robinson wrote about him in his journal, and my old lady eyes cannot see that far. Last week I tried to read you a quote that I hung far away, and it sounded like I couldn't read. So here we go. He said, "We halted and gazed with much wonder and admiration, and with tears and much joy. There was an emotion of feeling in our bosoms that we cannot describe. Suffice to say, the valley looked very good to us then. We descended and entered the valley to the 1st of October, 1848. I drove into the fort. The brethren had built a fort that they might protect themselves. The next day I went south 6 or 8 miles to see some corn that John, our colored man, had raised." And so he goes on to say that he was so filled with emotion to see their homestead already prepared. So John had prepared it. So the whole time I'm reading this story of John, I can't help but wonder if he also had his own testimony of the church, or if he was a slave to these people, and so it was here, you get to just come along for the ride. But I think one indication of his own testimony was that he did donate the burial of that fellow member as his tithing offering. And so that's one way. And I think going ahead and preparing the land and stuff was a pretty noble and big thing that he did, even though it was kind of required of him. Another thing to think about with poor John is that he spent a lot of time taking care of and preparing the way for another family, while he never had a family of his own. And that is the harsh reality of slavery. It sounds like the Robinsons and his former slave owner, Brother Burton, it sounds like they did their best to treat him really kindly and things like that. They trusted him clearly to go ahead of them and things of that nature, but we can't let that blind or cloud our vision to the fact that he still was a slave, and there's still the fact that he didn't get to do some of the basic things that others got to do simply because he was a slave. So that being said, after spending some time in the Salt Lake Valley, he received his patriarchal blessing by John Smith, and in his blessing, this is so fascinating to me, Brother Smith told him that he was born in 1797 and that in Campbell County, Virginia, and Brother Smith told him his parents' names were Zachariah and Jenny. We have no record of his birthplace or his parents, and it's quite likely, due to the historical nature of the time, that John didn't know either. And so his patriarchal blessing gave the insight that he needed to know who his parents were and his place of birth were. And I just find that to be so significant, and I wish I could have been in that room when he received that patriarchal blessing, because I think that would have been so amazing to see him learn that part of his heritage. I know that I'm drawn to learn more about my heritage. I know that a lot of you are as well. And imagine if you had nothing, not even your parents' name, how humbling that would be to get that knowledge. After a little bit of time in the Salt Lake Valley, the Robinsons, so Sister McCord and Joseph Robinson, were called to go settle a little more south in Utah in what we now know as Parowan. We know that they got there really early on, and he started establishing it there. And they were called by the general authority George A. Smith, who at the time was calling people to do that. A few years after living there, in 1861, so like a decade later, they decided to build the first chapel. So they lived there a long time without one. And the clerk recorded that John had donated $15 to the building of that. And so in the record, it has John Burton's name, the $15, and then next to that it says African, which I was surprised to see a little bit because honestly, that's the most like, aren't they looking delicious? African is like the most politically correct name I had ever heard somebody be recorded as, so that was interesting to me. But it shows that, it does show that in some way he was permitted to earn money somehow, which was not usual for slaves. Obviously, they were considered property and that all of their work belonged to their master. So somehow he was earning money or able to make some of his time his own by doing that tithing donation, by digging that burial plot. And so that's where I said that sometimes it can look like that they treated him as well as they maybe could. And I don't know that for sure, like I'm making that up based on what I read, you know? But that's where we can kind of infer that they treated him well, is that like he did have money to donate. He did have time to donate, so maybe he was treated a little bit differently than other slaves typically were at the time. So I don't know if you recall, but in 1862, the slavery ended in the nation by the constitutional amendment. And we don't know if anyone ever told John. And that is just the case for a lot of slaves. A lot of slaves were either never told about it, and so they just kept living as slaves, like they couldn't get on Instagram and find out about it for themselves, or they were told about it and like set free, but then there were so many restrictions on they couldn't live here, they couldn't do this, they couldn't work at this place, they couldn't do that, that a lot of them ended up quote unquote working for their slave owner and like for nothing. So it was not much different than just being a slave still for a lot of people for a really long time. So we don't know if John Burton even knew he was ever free in his lifetime, because he died in 1865, so 3 years after that happened, and he was still like living with and communicating with the family. He's buried in the cemetery in Parowan, I believe near members of the Robinson family. And a couple months before he passed away, got another quote in June 1865. So I only know that he died in 1865. I don't know what day, but I know it was after June. The Robinson family has this in their like family history, and they say it's an authentic letter. We don't know for sure if it's authentic because in the census it stated that John was a slave that could not read or write. So if this was a letter from John, it would have been dictated by somebody, but it is, that being said, it is a letter to Robinson's daughter, Mary Jane, and it says this: Mary Jane, I am glad that you thought enough of me to mention me in your letter. Tell Aunt Maria that I have not forgot her kindness to me. Tell your father that I was glad he sent me a shirt, for I was in want of one. I understand that you have a good prospect of plenty of fruit. Be so kind to send me a little if you have a chance. I am suffering with chills and fever, but I feel good in spirits. I rejoice every day of my life in the spirit of Mormonism. Give my respects to all the family. Most respectfully, John. So finally, the question that I had answered the whole time I was studying about John, if he was a member of the church out of duty or out of love, I feel like that letter sums it up. He rejoices every day in the spirit of Mormonism. And I can only guess or assume that the chills and the fever that he talks about in that letter ended up taking his life a few weeks or months, we're not totally sure, later. So that is the story of John Burton. He is such an awesome early pioneer member of the church. Next week, we are going to hear from about our first sister who is African American that joined the church, so make sure you join us then. Thank you so much for coming. It was so fun to talk about John Burton with you, and I can't wait to see you again next week. Goodbye.